So I'm going to do something which is impossible, which is a lecture of an hour and a half in 30 minutes. So here we go. I call myself an XR designer mostly because nobody knows what that means, and that affords us and everybody a lot of space to figure out what it can become. So I certainly hope we'll never get to the point that we know what it is. Some of the work I've been doing, because I'm also teaching, I'm a researcher, but I'm also advising people in what I would call as a technical dramaturg to build meaningful experiences. And one of them is soul paint.
Have you ever noticed where you feel? Everyone has a hidden story. This is a chance to explore yours. An experience that brings together art and science to reveal the infinite and complex worlds of feeling hidden within us all. Soul paint. Where are you feeling?
And I could give a lecture on the whole project itself, which I will not do, but I think the question where are you feeling rather than what are you feeling is relevant here, because we feel things in our bodies, and that can be physical sensations or an emotional sensations or everything in between, and often they're also very much connected and related, and it's very hard to share this inner world that we carry with others, especially if you have to do that in words, because it's not always easy to say things what you feel in words. So they invented body mapping, which is actually drawing sensations through color and shapes and etc. On flat pieces of paper as a way to mediate the conversation on what you feel. And so we turn that into a three-dimensional experience where you can make your own body map on the basis of how you feel in that moment, or maybe you have a memory or traumatic experience, whatever the context is, and then actually, and this is the most important part, you can share it with others. So this notion of, and Maria was actually mentioning this already, the social aspect of VR, of sharing, is such an important aspect. So where do we feel? I want to say a few things about immersion. Don't talk about immersion, sorry, I will. Because we have to, because indeed it's used a lot. In a literal sense, immersion is just about, being submerged into something. But the big misunderstanding, I think Maria was already mentioning this in a good way, that doesn't necessarily mean you feel you're there, but you're surrounded in a way by something. Yeah. So, and it can also be a deep mental state that you're completely immersed in. So it's not necessarily indeed only visual. And this indeed has a long history. So this is, of course, Panorama Mesdag in The Hague, which is the largest painting we have, I think. And it's really nice because the whole building was actually designed to afford people to climb underneath the thing and then pop up in the middle of the painting, and then you have a 360 experience. But the question is, do you actually experience being at the beach? No, you don't. It's immersive, and it's definitely a different environment, but you're also very much aware you're looking at a painting. So that's perfectly fine, but you see that this idea of complete immersion is very dominant in our modern culture. I don't know what people think about TeamLab's work. I personally think it's very kitsch-like, but that's just a matter of taste. But what it generally does, it creates spaces that are fully projected and often also interactive in the sense that the graphics are live generated and respond to people in the room. And in that you sort of create new, or well, at least different kind of spaces that you might be used to in ordinary life. Let's call it visual poetry or poetic spaces. And you see there that of course, it doesn't mean you need a headset per se. There are different ways to immerse people in a space that surrounds you, that gives you different sensations and or experiences. And this, when combined to the idea of VR, or actually technological development, is an old dream as well. So I think this is really nice that Morten Heilig already in the 50s or 60s tried to sort of create a device where you would be immersed with all senses, or a lot of them at least, in some sort of stereoscopic cinema, surround sound, moving image, but also smell and stuff were involved. So it's a multimodal, involving all the senses kind of experience. And again, the promise was is if you get as much as senses in, you're going to be immersed in that experience. And recently I went to June 2, the film, and by coincidence, I didn't pay attention. I bought this 4D ticket, and I've been sitting in a chair like this, and I was very immersed in the chair moving, but it was completely taking me from the whole film altogether. So it's problematic. I think we need to talk about abbreviations because there is so much understanding about it. I don't mind either. They're just definitions, and there's also industry spoiling the whole conversation all the time. But I think it's good to talk about an experiential scale. So let's assume we call what we are in right now reality. Yeah, can we just agree for now? Otherwise, we should have another hour for a different conversation on the nature of reality. I'll get back to that at the end, but let's assume we all agree that what reality is. And then if you take this as an experiential scale, not about devices, not about Microsoft or Apple having a device with a certain label, but rather say, okay, it's the experience of computer-generated environment. So here we have some sort of like analog generated environment, and there you have computer. And then you can actually mix, so it's an experiential scale you can move up and down on. The problem with that is that people say, yeah, so that means immersive VR is not part of mixed reality, because when you have a VR headset on, you're completely somewhere else. It's not mixing the physical world. I personally find that really stupid, because you're still very much with your body somewhere. And you're also very aware of where you are with your body somewhere. So actually, to me, VR, immersive VR, is also always mixed reality. Maybe not by design, but definitely by experience. But because of these confusions, people start to think about how to then come up with a new abbreviation to also encompass immersive VR. And that we now call XR. And some other people start talking about blockchain and AI being part of that as well, and then I lose the discussion. So let's not go there. So it's an experiential scale where you really mix physical, virtual, analog, digital. Okay, if we can agree for that for now, it's maybe good to talk about how you go from immersion to presence. And this is very much in line with the earlier presentation, making critical notes, because if you have technologists explaining what immersion means, they come up with sentences like, immersion means you feel surrounded by the image, while presence means you feel you're in the virtual world. So you really have this very naive definition of what it means to be somewhere. They also then use the word presence a lot, which then is something like, presence is a shortened version of the term telepresence, which is not true. It's a psychological state of subjective perception in which all of the individual's perception fails to accurately acknowledge the role of the technology in the experience. In just layman terms, what they're saying is if the technology is so good that we don't experience it anymore, then what the technology is mediating, you will experience as being real. So this is a perfect illusion dream. Make the technology transparent, and then we will believe wherever the technology is mediating. I find that very interesting and naive point, because I'm very aware that I'm wearing a headset. Even if it's lightweight, I do remember putting it on. So unless before I was born somebody hacked me into the matrix, which is a different discussion, I'm quite aware when I make a shift from one space to another. Even if the technology is very lightweight. But it is true that our brains are very flexible. They're constantly recalibrating what's true. So duration here is an interesting factor. If I'm in VR, and I was in VR a lot during COVID, I did like 6-hour sessions, I did tend to forget a little bit the room I was in. And then I would step on my cat, and the cat would make sure that I was aware of my body again. But so there you sense that, you know, the plasticity of the brain does adapt over time. Now, let's talk about presence a little bit here. Let's take a 360 capture of a ballet piece. So here you, first of all, the choreographer had to redesign the whole choreography to all the audience to be in the center of the stage, but that's a different discussion. What really happens is they're promising this idea, you're really in the middle of that dance performance. Now, I'm not an expert on dance, but I have been to some dance performances, and I can tell you when I saw this 360 movie, it had nothing to do with a dance performance. And why? Because I'm looking at pixels, pre-recorded light on a sort of bubble around me. I couldn't feel the bodies, I couldn't smell the bodies, I couldn't see the fatigue. It was just pixels, captured light around me. So this idea of saying you're really in between the presence of the dancers is definitely not the case. I wasn't there and they weren't there either. But what if then you sort of start recording the dancer in three-dimensional space, motion capture. So you capture the dancer in its full kinesthetic glory and then play it back in real time in a 3D engine. So this is La Pairie. You can still download it, I think. And it's really nice. You're in a three-dimensional space. That dancer, mocap dancer, is dancing around you in a way. And you can spatially relate to that dancing body with your own body. So I did feel, in a way, a physical presence of the dancer. Until I tried to sort of connect with the dancer, trying to play with particles or be in the way, whatever. And then the dancer, of course, would completely ignore me because, of course, while the dancer was in space, in the same space, in time, she was somewhere else because it was pre-recorded. So here you feel there is a certain sense of presence, but you're not present in the same time. So what if you then make it real time? So this is an interesting piece by Gilles Joubin. There were 3 different studios all over the world streaming mocap data of dancers into a virtual theater. And then online people could join that theater. Very social thing also, because they made a virtual theater. You had to buy a ticket and also in VR really walk to the black box stage, talking to your fellow, like, I'm so curious what will happen. So all the conventional codes of going to a performance was working out. And here you see the dancers being streamed. You see the cameras in the background with the studios. Of course, you could fake this. You could still have everything pre-recorded, but I sort of took it as being true. And then you see all these matchsticks, and those are audiences. So the audience were sort of floating around. You were muted, so you could not talk anymore, but you would float around in between the live performance. And interestingly, I felt I was there, actually more by the presence of my fellow audience members, because we had conversations just before we went in. So they were actually more real to me. But the dancers also were instructed to completely ignore those matchstick figures. So while we were actually in real time, both in time and space in the same space, my presence was not acknowledged by the dancers. And through that, it actually made me wonder why the hell I was there to begin with, right? Because then, just let me put in a room like this and I'll just be, like a passive spectator. So this is an interesting question. And then I ended up being invited to an experiment by Improvive, a small company here in the Netherlands. And they were performing a piece, a durational piece. It took more than an hour and a half, where 2 dancers are actually performing snake-like bodies. You see there on the right the dancers in the studio, and you could just again log in with VR in this virtual dance space. There's one of the audience members just jumping in. So suddenly you're there, and you're like, okay, I have a very weird snake-like body, and I see two other snakes moving. And then you realize your controllers can actually move your spine. So you don't have hands, you cannot talk, but you can move your spines in ways that I got really jealous of. And because you can make these fantastic, like shapes and figures and movements around each other. So slowly but surely, more and more people come into the room and start to also then be involved with the dance. And what I thought was very interesting is, of course, you don't see the studio, so you could see that only online if you would log out and just look at the screen. And then the dancers start to turn their attention to the audience members. So they start to invite the audience members to participate. And what was very interesting to me is that one of those dancers, and I don't even know which one, came to me and started to sort of snake almost around me. So I was like turning into this spiral movement together. And through that, our faces became closer and closer. And the moment that black snake dancer face came close to mine, my cheeks started to glow. I felt the warmth. And that to me was like, what? And it was very interesting because the suggestion of somebody being close triggered all sorts of psychosomatic responses that made me feel that warmth. And this memory to me is still in my body. I can remember it as being a very physical encounter that was very sensual and very hypnotic and very weird. So I think this is interesting that here presence was really strongly there because I could feel the dancers were present, but I felt present too because I was acknowledged by the other. This we call social presence, but I think it's very important when you design pieces that you think about how do I acknowledge my audience in the experience if it is interactive in real time. Okay, let's quickly now get to the point of embodiment. Embodiment is interesting in VR. Everyone who has done VR, especially badly designed VR, knows you get sick. So your body is very responsive to VR, even if you know it's not real. Now, Cardavi's already in the second wave of VR made very interesting works when it comes to these spaces. This is Osmosis from 1995. And here you could actually be in a etheric forest, and you could fly around. But she had a background in scuba diving, and she knew that if you breathe in, you go up in the water, and if you breathe out, you go down in the water. This is called buoyancy. It's actually the combination of weight and air in your vest. And so she took that as a navigation mechanic for the actual experience. So there's a little sensor at your chest. When you breathe in, you go up in the space, and when you breathe out, you go down. You can even go underground, fly between the roots and go up again. So interestingly, if you would do this experience, and I haven't done it myself, but everybody who is in the practice of conscious breathing, maybe through yoga or otherwise, knows that your perception changes when you change your whole metabolism by the amount of oxygen that you take in. So people really got really spaced out in that experience, right? So this is using almost like a physiological sensory apparatus mechanic for a poetic, philosophical experience. So here the body is used as a mechanic, as a part of the design to change somebody's perception or receptiveness to whatever is given visually. Now, you were talking about Marco Polo already, so maybe I shouldn't. But the thing is, what I like about them or their earlier experience, whether it's ethically sound with consent or not, is that they really have experimented a lot with physical spaces and virtual spaces, using both real-time 3D technologies, but also 360 videos. So it's a very interesting group that done a lot of experiments, and I think this notion of activating the body in a physical space in relation to a virtual environment is a very powerful way to tell different kind of stories or create different kind of experiences. It's also interesting, I noticed with a lot of these experiments, and this is an older, there's still a lot of experiments that we do. My students here sitting in front, they will do it also in a few weeks. But this notion of connecting to physical objects while seeing virtual things, your brain, if it gets a connection like, oh, I can actually touch it, it starts to get receptive to everything else. Like, oh, but then maybe everything else is also real. So you can really play with this, what you can actually touch and not touch. And then, of course, again, play with the expectation. And sometimes maybe it's not there at all. Okay, so another thing I want to stress here is that indeed it should not be dominantly or predominantly visual. When you talk about embodiment and involving the body in experience, it's very important to think about all senses. So think about the sensorama. This interesting work by Polymorph called Symbiosis. Their attempt to make us feel non-human is, of course, by definition, going to fail, because it's impossible to not be human, because we are. But at least they did an attempt to make you feel non-human by putting you in very elaborate suits that would give you different kind of sensations. So there's, for example, this amphibious frog creature that you can choose, and they have like these pockets here next to your neck that sort of inflates, so you feel almost like what a frog would have when they make their sounds. They would put all sorts of smells in your nose. They spoon feed you all sorts of hideous algae food. With certain creatures, you're actually strapped to other people, so there's this very uncanny feel with a stranger that you're one body. So it definitely made me not necessarily feel like non-human, but it did make me feel very aware of my body. And I think it's important to sort of keep experimenting with these multimodal approaches to these experiences. Okay, if you want to know more about it, I did a longer lecture with a lot of examples going into presence more, so that is maybe nicer to do some other time, because I do want to talk a little bit about how to design for these things. Because if we know that these experiences are embodied, how do you then involve your body in actually designing those experiences? So please don't blink, because this is a time lapse of a piece I made a few years ago. It was for the Prague Quadrennial, a theater design, scenography, architecture, once in every 4 years, international conference thing with a lot of work. And we created an intermedial space with a very large team of artists doing like soundscapes, lights, little physical objects and installations. And in there, we made a VR installation where we created a digital double of the space and then actually in VR pull you out through the roof into a liminal space where we do some poetic pieces with 360 VR combined with real-time 3D. That's not important. What is important here is that we're mixing realities by letting you start in an already intermedial immersive space, and then when you put the headset on, that same space is doubled. So when you touch like a thing you had to step in, it's there. And then when you step in, we pull you in VR out of, and then the roof opens up and the whole building deconstructs itself. And this is actually for designers a very powerful way of starting where you are and then pull them somewhere else, rather than saying, you're now here, but when you put the headset on, you're somewhere else. So this is about designing transitions. But this is not easy, because often when I work with designers, they sit behind desks and they look at screens and they have assumptions on what is meaningful and how it will work. But the question is, of course, is this actually true? So being partly based in theater, I know there's something like trying things out. And this, of course, is important because in the end, the designer doesn't know how it feels. Because there are many things that we assume will work in VR, and then when you actually build it, it ends up being completely different. So how to solve that problem of being behind your desk, not having anything yet, while the actual physical experience is fundamentally different? Well, I tried to sort of solve that by using theater principles. So what we did is we created a very early prototype mock-up of the digital double, and then we started to perform.
All right, so you just arrived. You're a helmet, given a helmet. Never seen a helmet before. Yeah, puts it on your head.
So we improvised a user entering that space. We had a rudimentary idea of the progression of certain steps. It was not animated yet. It was not programmed yet. Everything was under a little device which we call a MIDI controller. So my operator or puppeteer, whatever you want to call it, was live performing reactions of the environment to one of my other colleagues here, Paul Segis, one of the designers, pretending not to know anything. And so he consciously makes himself stupid, forgetting everything that we talked about in the design, and performs from the position of the here and now and listens carefully to his body, what his body wants to do in response to what the environment is doing. And then suddenly a lot of things we thought would work didn't work at all, but also certain things emerged out of those improvised sessions that actually provided us with a lot of interesting information on design decisions. I don't have time to go into them, but I do want to emphasize this point here, that you need to make certain physical connections with your prototype, and then the person who is in VR basically performing the user, needs to have a certain inner sense, like an inner presence, to really listen to how the body is responding to the given design, and then also have the language to voice that immediately. So then the people from the outside can respond to that and make adaptations or ask questions for further clarification. And with that information, in very short burst of improvisation, we got a lot of information on what worked and didn't work in our prototypes. So this is really, in devising theater, this is a very normal way of working, but it's hardly ever done in the field of XR. And I can really, really encourage you to think about these methodologies more, so we end up hopefully with more embodied and meaningful interactions within XR. So it also has to do with different roles that you can divide in the group. And another advice I can give is to swap the roles. So then also say, okay, I've now been puppeteering the environment. Now I will go in and you puppeteer the environment, or I'll be the director for the next half hour. So this interdisciplinary work should also mean a technician once in a while has a saying in the artistic decisions, and or a director should really also experience his own ideas, because then suddenly things become different and decisions are made differently. So because I only have half an hour, again, just use the QR codes. You can read about it if you want. I placed a nice article on it, and I will develop this into a methodology called performative prototyping, including also how to then actually use all these technologies in an early stage of design. So to sort of make a point here, in terms of embodiment and presence, the physical body is central to the experience, always. Even if you make a 360 documentary and have people sit on a chair, the body is still the vehicle for the experience. So you need to think about how to design for that. You need to incorporate the body in the design to make sure that it makes sense. This doesn't always mean that the body is responding in the ways that you want. So what you will have is a combination of bottom-up and top-down influences. So the nervous system might respond in one way, but at the same time your brain knows it's not true. And so there's a lot of conflict happening within your system. So it's not about creating a singular experience. It's actually about embracing all these contradictory things that happen in the person at that particular moment. Mel Slater, well-known researcher, psychologist already since the 90s, has done a lot of research on presence and embodiment. And one of the things he says is the whole point of presence is that it's the illusion of being there, notwithstanding that you know for sure that you are not. It is a perceptual, but not a cognitive illusion. Now, for a long time, everybody agreed on that. And then I think to add to that is that, yes, and we also are in different places at the same time. And while the computer scientists and technologists want to solve this problem by making it like a singular perfect illusion, I would, especially to the front row of my students here coming to art school, say embrace the fact that you're in several places at the same time. It actually becomes interesting when you're in several places at the same time, because they can collide, they can be in dialogue, they can sometimes merge and sometimes contradict, and that comes maybe closer to meaningful experiences than having a singular, flat, one-dimensional experience. And now, indeed, as promised, David Chalmers, because indeed, David Chalmers, a philosopher who's been thinking about fundamental questions on perception of reality for quite a while, wrote this wonderful book, which I can really recommend because he really explains it very clearly and with nice examples. It's fun to read. It's not academic at all. But he says, actually, no. It's not an illusion. It's reality. Being in VR is a real experience. The only problem is we should not compare it with the reality that we experience that is in a world made of atoms. The fact is, in VR, the world is made of bits and bytes. And that means in VR, you can walk through a wall, you can change your scale, you can sort of, have all sorts of different kind of rules that you need to attune to. So if you're saying our physical atomic reality is the only reality there is, he says, no. VR is a digital reality. And the fact is, especially during Corona times, I've had very profound social, deep experiences with people in spaces that I physically remember. So are you now going to tell me that's not real? So it's a very fundamental conversation that you could agree with or not, but it's good to talk about this because the fact is I have had very real experiences. And also, and this is phenomenology was already mentioned, he calls it a phenomenology of virtuality. And this experienced users, VR users know this. When I put my VR headset on, I literally shift in how my perceptual apparatus, but also my proprioceptive kinesthetic systems are wired. I have two systems now. When I go in VR, I can immediately just, go to the floor or fly. I don't want to do that in real life, I will get sick. But in VR, I can immediately switch because I've adapted to that way of being in virtual space. For me to scale down or scale up or go through the roof, that's perfectly normal. To get stuff, just to manipulate things from a distance with lasers, just normal. And I feel it as a physical perception. It's not just make-believe. My body's really operating in that way. And every time I return, for example, back to physical Newtonian or atom-based reality, sometimes I'm like, oh, I really have to go to that door to close it, right? Or, yeah, okay, I cannot fly. It will take a while to get there. But anyway, that's another question altogether. To summarize, just maybe they're just... They're not academically sound discussions I just opened up, but I just have hopefully given you some thoughts on how immersion, presence, and embodiment relate, and how I would advocate to you as makers, please incorporate the body as early as possible in your design experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joris. Do we have any questions in the room? Agnes, Maria, okay.
Thank you very much for the very inspiring talk. It's not exactly a question, but it's rather an unpolished comment. That with you also showed the VR experience that are using various type of sensorial material on your body. And I started, it's very subjective, but I started to have this feeling that actually when you have these kind of devices that are vibrating here and there and where, that's actually reminding you in VR that you have a body, and that's kind of like taking you out from the experience. Yes. So do you have any positive example about it?
No, I agree. It's the same with the 4D cinema thing, that the chairs are so dominant that I cannot even watch the film anymore. So yeah, very much so. And so this is another thing, is that don't keep adding more to it, right? If you add something, you have to take something away. So I think I don't want to be too critical, because I think Symbiosis was a very good experiment. So they really went for it. And you have to be brave to do these things in these times with very little money. So they're doing an excellent job. But it is a fact that they threw everything in. So I was mostly overwhelmed and not getting even a chance to get attuned to or situate myself into that new experience, because of course it's on a festival, people have to get in and out, la la la, you know, all those things were under pressure. So to me, it was completely overwhelming. So if you do go multimodal, it's sometimes also very good to say, another example, VR opera. I've seen now several pieces that are sold as VR operas. If you ask me afterwards, how was the music? I don't remember. Because I've been walking through all these psychedelic, wonderful worlds. And of course, the opera unconsciously does give a sense of space and atmosphere. But I've not really been listening, right? So it's really, when you go for these approaches, it's very good to take something away if you put something else in. And I agree with using sound more and seeing less, for sure. Yeah, imagination is also a space, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add maybe the opposite question, because I see your point about how the physical can be overwhelming the digital, or the physical can actually be a glitch in the experience. How about glitches in the virtual experience, and maybe intentional glitches?
Yeah, it makes me think of a very old piece I once did. where I entered the room and somebody said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here because we lost a person in cyberspace and you have to go and find that person." And they put you on a chair and then you see all these monitors and stuff, and she puts a headset on and you look through the headset with the camera at the person and she's like, "Are you okay? Are you ready? Okay, we're going to start the simulation. It's my sister, she has a red dress, to go and find her." And then they let you go through 360 video, half 3D, very glitchy spaces, like really disrupts where I am. I get dizzy and everything. And sometimes you see the person and she's gone again. And it's also not particularly polished at all, right? So I got on the edge of being sick. And then at some point they shift back to live feed. So you see the person again. She says, "You have to come out now. You have to come out now because something went wrong and before we know we lose you as well. Please put your headset on a chair and come out, come out." And so I was first looking like, okay, this is a great performance. And then at some point, okay, so I put the headset off and I put it on the chair next to her where she was pointing. And I'm standing here and she's standing there and she's still looking at the empty chair where I got up from. And she just continues. So she's like, "You have to get out. You put and I'm standing here. Right? And so the key moment of my actual confusion, because I really felt, it was just a split second, I really felt, oh my God, I got out in the wrong dimension. No, but physically, like a moment of panic, like, and then I was like, oh, this is smart. So she really used VR to disorient myself in order to be receptive to that performed piece of saying, you're sitting in that chair and you're not where you think you are, right? So you can use VR not necessarily for the illusion, but to also disrupt. So you resensitize people to reality and then, do something else. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a different approach. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. This is really interesting. And I think we fundamentally agree on the issues of embodiment and so on. But someone mentioned boredom. And so there's been a rising interest in all of this stuff, and particularly the kinds of real spaces with projections and so on. Yeah. And I'm going to bungle the name now, but Van Gogh, I guess. Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce this properly. There's an exhibition traveling the world. It's super popular. And I agree with you. They're sort of trite, but I'm wondering, is it that we are so bored that we need all of this sensory engagement, and is it taking something away that is perhaps a little bit more reflective and intellectual? This is a very open-ended question, and it goes for everything. We haven't talked about porn, but there's work in porn and kind of sexuality, both the kind of porn that's more mainstream, but also other people trying to engage with this. And I'm wondering if we're all so bored with our digital environments now.
Well, that's for everybody individually to answer, of course. But I do agree that maybe when we talk about sensitizing people and being oversensitized, so if you say more input, more and more, everything has to be involved all the time. I'm sure, and this is already true, we have information overload, there are all sorts of burnouts to our nervous system. I'm not sure if that's boredom, but it's just we cannot take it in anymore. And this also aligns a little bit with the Sidra thing, so I think that is true. So I'm not sure if that's about boredom, but I do have a lot of students that talk about making installations where you can return to the here and now for a moment, and then I'm like, okay, go sit in a forest. Yeah, breathe. Yeah, but so I find all these meditation applications always a bit, I'm not sure if we need to go in that direction. There's this wonderful world that will heal you if you take the time. But so it's subjective. It's different for different people. But I think it does aligns a little bit with the earlier comment to say, if you put something in, also think about what you take away. And the notes on blindness are a very good example, is that they lower the visual, so you become more sensitive, and then the visuals that are there sensitize you in a new way to space. But there's a lot of darkness there. And I liked also that when you were making sounds, that you see these waves and it appears and then it disappears again. So the baseline is actually darkness. Instead of there's already a lot and now we're going to throw even more. Because if everything moves, you don't know what to look at anymore. Yeah, but I'm not sure if it's the same as boredom. So that would be another conversation, which is very interesting as well. I think we forgot to be properly bored. I cannot remember being bored for a long time already. Yeah, which is probably a problem. Yeah. Thanks.
One more question? Or, well, the thing is, we are living at 3:40 and we need to clear the room at 4:30. So we have a group decision to make. Do we have a short break now? 5 minutes, 10 max, and then we just have 40 minutes for the last presentation of Agnes? Sure. Yeah? So we should do that, and then afterwards we have all the time to sit on the terrace in the sun, in the real and to be bored. Thank you.